All right, let's dive right into this explainer, because today we're looking at something truly extraordinary. We're exploring the narratives of two of history's most epic, larger-than-life figures, Elijah and Samson. Based on ancient text and even some recent cinematic interpretations, we're going to unpack the massive psychological and theological burdens placed on those chosen to stand alone against the tide of history. It's a fascinating pattern of power, human frailty, and redemption. Actually, it's a pattern we see echoed later in the epic story of David, or as it's often revered, Quokdai vua David vidai, the great life of King David. But that incredible legacy starts right here, with two radically different men.
Now, what's really interesting about this is the massive contrast we're hit with right out of the gate. On one side, you have Elijah, often called the prophet of fire. His power, it wasn't in his muscles. It was this commanding spiritual authority. He was like a voice of distant thunder that could literally shut up the heavens. And then on the other side, you have Samson, widely known as the strongest man in the Bible. His defining trait was unmatched, supernatural physical strength. I mean, lions literally fell before him. So we're looking at absolute spiritual dominance going head-to-head with absolute physical power.
To make sense of their parallel journeys, here's our roadmap for this explainer. We've got 6 key stops: the call in the dark, power and authority, the darkness of solitude, betrayal and fall, justice and salvation, and finally, their timeless legacy.
So, let's kick things off with part 1, the call in the dark. Because to really understand these men, you have to understand the era that forged them.
You see, neither of these guys emerged during times of peace. Not even close. They were unlikely deliverers called into severe, suffocating darkness. For Elijah, it was a profound spiritual void left by Queen Jezebel's false idols and her ruthless suppression of truth. For Samson, well, his darkness was a crushing physical weight, 40 brutal years of Philistine occupation. Understanding this tension is absolutely crucial because it shows exactly why their absolute brands of power were so desperately needed in such a fractured world.
Just consider the sheer weight of this promise regarding Samson's origins. Before he was born, he was chosen. Before he could walk, a promise had already been spoken over his life. This wasn't some job he could casually apply for or just walk away from on a bad day. No way. This was a heavy, inescapable Nazirite vow placed on him from the very womb. He was set apart before he even took his first breath, irrevocably destined to carry the liberation of his people.
And that early promise brings us to Section 2, Power and Authority, where we witness the breathtaking rise of these chosen deliverers.
The feats these men accomplished are, for lack of a better word, legendary. Samson discovers his terrifying power by tearing apart a roaring lion with his bare hands. And later, he takes down an entire army of 1,000 warriors using nothing but the jawbone of a donkey. It's raw, unrestrained physical dominance. Elijah, meanwhile, operates entirely in the realm of the miraculous. He confronts hundreds of false prophets on Mount Carmel, calling down fire from heaven to consume a drenched altar. Yet at the same time, he wields this tender, spiritual authority to raise a widow's son back to life.
Picture this cinematic scene with Elijah, completely surrounded by a hostile king's soldiers. He simply says, "If I am a man of God, may fire come down from heaven." What's so profound here is the absolute certainty behind his words. He didn't raise his voice, he didn't panic. It's a total contrast to the sheer anxiety of Ahab's forces. He didn't fear earthly kings because his authority came from a much higher source, and the physical world had no choice but to bow to it.
But here's the kicker. For decades, these two stood completely alone. They were the sole defenders of a desperate, fractured nation. Samson single-handedly judged his people and held the Philistines at bay for 20 whole years. And Elijah? He operated as a solitary prophet without a crown, without an army, fearlessly dismantling the entire corrupt, systemic empire of King Ahab and Queen Jezebel.
But carrying the immense weight of a nation on your shoulders, that takes a severe psychological toll. Which brings us to Section 3, the darkness of solitude.
Take a second and ask yourself, what happens when the strongest men are broken by their own humanity? We've talked about their supernatural feats, but they weren't unfeeling machines, right? They were flesh and blood human beings, and the burden of their divine callings was unimaginably heavy.
The greatest battles these men fought weren't actually out on the battlefield with armies or on mountains with false prophets. They were fiercely internal. Elijah's journey was marked by silent persecution, fleeing for his life, and a profound, crushing solitude in the harsh wilderness, where he literally begged for it all to end. Samson experienced a deep, weary desire for just a shred of normalcy. After 20 years of constant conflict, he sought peace and intimacy in the Valley of Sorek. That intense isolation that inherently comes with absolute responsibility, that is the true defining struggle in both of their stories.
And it's exactly in that deep human vulnerability that both men encounter their greatest crises. Let's move to section 4, betrayal and fall.
Let's walk through this rapid, tragic escalation of Samson's downfall. It starts in the Valley of Sorek, where he meets Delilah. Seeking rest and trust, he instead finds a snare. He's betrayed by the woman he loves, which leads to the devastating loss of his supernatural strength and, tragically, his sight. He ends up bound in the prison of Gaza. The irony here is just inescapable. The man whose physical might could shatter entire armies was ultimately brought down by his total inability to conquer his own internal desires.
Now contrast Samson's deeply personal betrayal with the systemic political betrayal in Elijah's story, specifically the incident with Naboth's vineyard. King Ahab wants the citizens' ancestral vineyard. When he's told no, Queen Jezebel orchestrates this deadly corrupt scheme, using false witnesses to execute an innocent man just to steal his land. A total betrayal of justice. But stepping right into this empire of corruption is Elijah, fearless as ever, arriving at the literal scene of the crime to declare absolute divine judgment on the king.
These betrayals push both men to their absolute limits, stripping away everything they'd relied upon. And that leads us into section 5, justice and salvation.
When Elijah confronts King Ahab in that stolen vineyard, he delivers this heavy-hitting, chilling truth. I found you because you sold yourself to do evil in the eyes of the Lord. It's a stark reminder that the voice of the prophet does not bow to crowns. It does not negotiate with earthly power. Even when the king thought he had completely gotten away with murder in the shadows, Elijah was right there to ensure that ultimate justice prevailed in the light.
Meanwhile, for Samson, salvation looks very, very different. It's in the absolute darkness of captivity, blind, broken, and humiliated in Gaza, that Samson finally discovers what true strength has always been. His story highlights a profound truth. Immense physical strength might be enough to save a nation, but it is only pure humility that can save a soul.
Samson's ultimate victory comes through absolute surrender. It all begins with one final, sincere prayer to God, recognizing for the first time where his power truly originates. This is followed by one final act of obedience as he pushes against those pagan pillars. And it culminates in the massive collapse of the Temple of Dagon. He gives up his own life to fulfill his calling, creating this moment of profound redemption born entirely out of total surrender.
And this brilliantly illustrates just how different yet equally miraculous Elijah's climax was. He strikes the Jordan waters with his mantle, crossing on dry ground alongside his disciple. And then the heavens open up. A chariot of fire and horses of flame descend, and Elijah is taken up alive into a whirlwind. He didn't taste death. He was taken completely beyond human reach, perfectly matching the miraculous, unearthly nature of his entire life.
Both of these incredible journeys lead us to our final section, timeless legacy. What are we supposed to actually take away from all this?
The poetic differences in their departures are just absolutely stunning. Samson, the man of physical might who faltered under his human desires, finds his ultimate victory through a sacrificial, agonizing death among his enemies. Elijah, the man of unwavering spiritual authority who stood firm against corrupted kings, is honored by ascending alive in a whirlwind of flame. Their unique exits flawlessly match the distinct divine callings they each carried.
And that brings us to the core takeaway for today. When the strongest fall, they discover their strength was never truly their own. These aren't just ancient myths meant to entertain us. Not at all. They are profound, enduring studies of grace, of the unimaginably heavy burden of a calling, and of humanity's ultimate dependence on something far greater than ourselves.
So, I want to leave you with this provocative question to reflect on. Where does true strength really come from? Is it unmatched physical power, the ability to conquer lions and armies? Or is it found in the humility of the human spirit, that quiet authority to speak truth to power and surrender to a higher calling? Take a moment to think about that as you look at your own life. Because whether we're looking at Elijah, Samson, or even the sweeping epic of Quote Vuda Vid Vidai later on, the pattern holds true. Thanks for joining me on this explainer, and keep exploring the incredible truths hidden right there in these ancient texts.